Abigail Carter didn't cry when they laughed at her. She stood in the doorway of Ethan Callahan's ranch house, mud on her boots, a warning on her lips that nobody wanted to hear, and she swallowed every word back down like bitter medicine. She had learned a long time ago that quiet women don't get believed. They just get proven right too late. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Abigail Carter rode into Callahan Ranch, the sky was the color of old bone, pale and dry and cracked at the edges the way the earth had been cracking for 3 months straight. Summer in the Montana mountains didn't play favorites. It burned everything equally. The grass, the creek beds, the patience of men who thought they understood the land because they'd lived on it long enough to grow calluses. Ethan Callahan was standing outside the barn when she arrived. He didn't look up right away. He was studying a length of fence post he'd pulled from the ground, turning it over in his hands, jaw set the way it always was when something wasn't adding up. The wood was dry, too dry, the kind of dry that came from soil that had stopped holding moisture 3 feet down. Abigail pulled her mare to a stop at the edge of the yard and sat for a moment without moving. She looked at the barn. She looked at the water trough along the south fence. She looked at the cattle grazing in the far pasture the way they clustered near the fence line, rather than spreading out the way healthy animals do when they feel easy in their range. Then she looked at Ethan Callahan. He finally glanced up. His eyes were dark gray, the kind of gray that reminded her of storm clouds sitting just above the peaks, heavy with weather that hadn't decided what it was going to do yet. He studied her the way he'd studied the fence post, looking for the problem. "Help you," he said. "I'm here about the cook position," Abigail said. "I saw the notice posted in town." He looked at her horse. A small bay mare, older, well-kept, but not expensive. He looked at her saddlebag, which wasn't heavy. He looked at her hands, which were folded over the pommel, still not fidgeting. Then he looked at her face. "You got experience," he said. 8 years cooking for ranch crews," she said. 4 ranches. I can give you names if you need them." "Don't need names," he said. "I need somebody who can feed 12 men 3 times a day without complaint and keep the kitchen clean." "I can do that." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded once, short and final the way men like him made decisions. Not because they were certain, because they were done deliberating. $1.50 a week, he said. "Room in the back of the house. You start today." "Yes, sir," Abigail said. She stepped down from the mare and tied her to the hitching post. Ethan had already turned back toward the barn. He called over his shoulder without looking at her. "Kitchen's through the side door. Introductions can wait till supper." Abigail untied her saddlebag, threw it over her shoulder, and walked toward the house. She did not look at the kitchen first. She looked at the water trough again. Then she looked at the cattle again. Then she looked at the line of the hills to the east where the grass had gone from gold to gray, and something in the soil had gone wrong in a way that wasn't just drought. She said nothing. She went inside and started supper. The crew at Callahan Ranch was 12 men, and 11 of them didn't bother learning her name the first week. They called her the cook or Miss when they were being polite, and nothing at all when they weren't. They sat at the long table in the main room every morning and every evening and ate what she put in front of them and talked around her the way men talked around furniture as if it was present, but not worth addressing directly. The 12th man was a young hand named Cody, barely 19, who had the kind of manners that meant somebody had raised him well, and he hadn't yet been on the frontier long enough to unlearn them. On her 3rd morning, he came into the kitchen early and stood at the door with his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, "that was the best biscuit I've had since my mother's table. I just wanted to say so." Abigail looked up from the cast iron pan she was scrubbing. "Thank you, Cody." He looked surprised she knew his name. Then he smiled, quick and boyish, and put his hat back on and went out. She went back to scrubbing. She didn't need them to like her. She needed to understand the land she was on. And something about this land was telling her something was very wrong. It started with the horses. On her 4th day, Abigail carried a bucket of kitchen scraps out toward the compost pile behind the barn, and she stopped because one of the horses in the paddock, a big sorrel gelding the men called Duke, was standing at the fence, not drinking. The water trough was full. She'd seen one of the hands fill it that morning. But Duke stood at the edge of it, dropped his nose to the water, then lifted his head without drinking. She set down the bucket. She watched him for 5 minutes. He went back to the trough twice more. Each time he lowered his head, seemed ready, then pulled back. A horse that won't drink when water is available is a horse that doesn't trust what it's drinking. She walked to the trough and crouched beside it. She cupped a small amount of water in her palm and smelled it. Nothing obvious. But she pressed her fingers into the soil at the base of the trough post and brought them to her nose. Sulfur. Faint. But there. She stood and looked toward the hill to the east, the one where the grass had gone gray. She looked at the creek that ran down from that hill, reduced now to a thin thread of water along the bank barely moving. The men used it to supplement the well, had been using it all summer. She wiped her hand on her apron and went to find Ethan Callahan. She found him at the corral working a young horse on a long rope, moving the animal in slow circles. His focus was complete. He didn't look up when she approached the fence. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Bit busy, Miss Carter. I understand. I'll be brief." She put her hands on the fence rail and kept her voice level. "The water in the south trough has sulfur in it. Not a lot, but enough that Duke won't drink it. And I think it's coming from the creek, which means it's coming from somewhere up on that east hill where the grass has been dying." Ethan kept moving the horse in its circle. "Grass dies in a drought," he said. "Not like that," she said. "Not in patches like that. Drought takes things evenly. What's up on that hill takes things in circles. That usually means something underground." He stopped the horse. He turned and looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Carter," he said, not unkindly, but with the particular patience men used when they were explaining something they considered settled. "I've been working this land for 11 years. I know that hill, I know that creek. We've had dry summers before." "Yes, sir," she said. "I'm sure you have. The creek's low because it ain't rained, the grass is dying because it ain't rained, and the horses are particular sometimes." He turned back to the young horse. "Is there something else?" There was. There were several things. But she had been on this ranch for 4 days, and she was the cook, and she knew exactly how much that mattered to the 12 men who ate at Ethan Callahan's table. "No, sir," she said. That was all. She walked back to the kitchen. She started on the noon meal, and she decided she would have to find the answers herself, because no one here was going to go looking with her. That night, when the house was quiet and the last lamp in the bunkhouse had gone out, Abigail pulled on her boots and her coat and walked out into the dark. She carried a small lantern turned low. She walked east, following the dying creek bed, watching the ground change under her feet, the way it did when you paid attention, the soil getting thinner, the vegetation getting sparser, the particular smell of disturbed earth rising up even through the dry heat that still sat in the air after sundown. She walked for nearly 20 minutes before she found it. A section of ground on the east slope where something had shifted. She could feel it before she could see it, the way the ground gave slightly under her boot in a way ground didn't give when it was solid. She crouched and pressed both palms flat. There was water down there. Not surface water. Groundwater. A vein of it deep but present, following a line under the surface that she traced by walking slowly along it for 30 feet in each direction. But there was also something else. She found the old mine shaft on her second pass. It was half collapsed, half hidden by scrub brush, and what had once been a wooden cover now rotted to almost nothing. She held her lantern over the edge, and the sulfur smell came up strong enough to sting her eyes. An old silver working, abandoned years ago by the look of it. And the waste from it, the runoff, the chemical seep, had been finding its way into the water table slow and steady, getting worse as the water table dropped and concentrated what had been diluted before. The creek wasn't just low, it was poisoned at the source. And the groundwater vein she'd found, the one that ran under the east pasture, the one that the ranch could access if they dug for it, the one that sat below the contamination line, that was what could save them. If they dug a new well in the right place before the remaining surface water gave out completely. She stood in the dark on that slope for a long time, looking at the stars above the peaks, feeling the wind come down off the mountain with the particular texture of high summer. She thought about what she'd found. She thought about what it meant. She thought about Ethan Callahan's face when she'd stood at the corral fence, and he'd looked at her with that patient, certain expression. Then she walked back to the house, cleaned the lantern, and went to bed. She was going to need a better moment than a corral fence conversation. The better moment arrived in a way she hadn't planned. 3 days later, 2 of the cattle died. Not from the heat, not from starvation, from the water. Ethan Callahan stood in the pasture looking down at the first animal, and the expression on his face had changed. The certainty was still there, but there was something under it now. The first hairline crack in something he'd built over 11 years, and never had reason to question. His foreman, a thick-necked man named Garrett, who had been on the ranch almost as long as Ethan, and treated every idea that wasn't his own as a personal insult, crouched beside the animal and said, "Could be anything. Heat does things to cattle." "Heat doesn't do this," said one of the younger hands. He pointed at the animal's mouth, at something Abigail could see from where she stood 20 feet away. "That's not heat." Garrett stood up and looked at the young hand, the way he looked at everything he didn't want to hear. "You been here 2 months, boy. Don't tell me what heat does and don't." Abigail had come out with the men because she'd been carrying water from the kitchen to the south fence when the shout went up. She stood at the edge of the group, which had formed the way men formed around a crisis circle, shoulders forward, voices low, entirely closed to the one person among them who had known this was coming. She watched Ethan. He hadn't spoken since his first quiet words over the animal. He was still looking at it, really looking the way he looked at things when he was working a problem instead of defending a position. She took 1 step forward, just one. "Mr. Callahan," she said. Garrett turned first. His expression said everything he thought about the cook approaching a livestock situation. "Kitchen needs you, sweetheart," he said. She didn't look at Garrett. She kept her eyes on Ethan. "The water in the east trough is coming from the creek," she said. "The creek is being contaminated by an old mine shaft on the east slope. I found it 9 days ago. The sulfur compound coming out of that shaft is what killed these animals, and it's going to keep killing them." The silence that came after that was the kind that had weight. Garrett broke it first. "Now just hold on a minute. Let her talk." Ethan's voice was quiet, not loud, but the circle went still. He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd come out. "You found a mine shaft?" "Yes, sir. About 20 minutes east on foot up the slope, half collapsed. Old silver working from the looks of it. The runoff has been seeping into the water table for probably years, but it's worse now because the table's dropped and what was diluted before is concentrated." "You went up there alone," he said. "At night. During the day, the men are everywhere, and I didn't think you'd want to discuss it at the corral fence again," she said. Something moved through his eyes. Not quite amusement, not quite embarrassment. Something that was sitting between those two things and hadn't decided which one to become. "What else?" he said. She took a breath. "There's a groundwater vein running under the east pasture. About 60 feet down, I think, based on the way the ground reads, and where the surface moisture was holding longest before the drought set in. If you dig a new well at the right spot, you'll hit water that's below the contamination line. Clean water. Enough to carry the ranch through the rest of summer and probably beyond." Garrett made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a dismissal. "She's a cook who thinks she's a water diviner now. She's the only person standing here who saw this coming before 2 of my cattle died," Ethan said. Garrett went quiet. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set, but differently than before. This was a man working something out, not a man who'd already worked it out and was explaining his conclusion. "Show me the shaft," he said. Now, she said. Now, he said. Dog. She took him up the slope in the early afternoon heat, following the same path she'd walked in the dark 9 days before. He walked beside her, not behind her. That small thing told her something about him that changed the picture she'd been building. He didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. Then, how'd you know about groundwater? Grew up on a dryland farm in Kansas, she said. My father was always chasing water. He taught me what to look for. And the mines. I've worked ranches near old mining territory before. I know the smell. He nodded once. They kept walking. When they reached the shaft, she held the lantern over it, and the sulfur rose up the way it had before. He crouched and held his own hand over the opening, and then stood and walked the perimeter of the area the way she had, pressing his boot into the ground, reading what was underneath. He stood at the edge of the dead grass circle and looked down the slope toward his pastures and his cattle and his ranch buildings arranged in the valley below, and she could see him doing the arithmetic, the timeline. How long the contamination had been working, how long before it reached critical levels in the main well, how many animals he could lose. Wade Holloway told me last month the East Creek was natural low, he said. Said his ranch is using mountain melt and he's fine. Holloway's ranch is on the other side of the ridge, she said. He's not in this water table. He said he was. Ethan looked at her. Said my management was causing the cattle losses, overgrazing, poor rotation. She said nothing. He said, "You're telling me it's not my management." "I'm telling you the water is poisoned," she said. "What else might be true I can't say." He studied her with those storm-gray eyes for a long moment. Then he looked back down at his ranch. "If you're right about the groundwater vein," he said, "where do we dig?" She walked him down to the edge of the east pasture and crouched and showed him the signs she'd been reading for more than a week. The way the one scrubby stand of brush near the fence was deeper green than everything around it. The way the soil crumbled differently under her fingers there. The way the particular flatness of the ground indicated old water movement below. "Here," she said. "Within about 10 feet of this spot. If I'm wrong, you'll know it in the first 20 feet of digging." He looked at the ground. He looked at her. "And if you're right," he said, "then you'll have water by the end of the week," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you come to me with all of this the day you found the shaft?" She looked up at him from where she crouched. She held his gaze steadily. "I did come to you," she said. "You were working a horse." The hairline crack in his certainty widened just slightly. She watched it happen. "I told you the South Trough had sulfur in the water," she said. "You told me you'd been working this land 11 years, and that horses are particular sometimes." He said nothing. "I'm not saying that to be unkind," she said, standing. "I'm saying it because if I'd had different information at that moment, I would have come back sooner. But I didn't know about the shaft yet, and without the shaft, I was just the cook guessing at things she couldn't prove." "And now," he said. "Now you've seen the shaft," she said, "and 2 of your cattle are dead, and the proof is sitting right there in your pasture." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at the ground she'd pointed to. "I'll have the men start digging in the morning," he said. He turned and walked back toward the ranch. After a moment, she followed. Garrett didn't like it. That evening at supper, he made his feelings known in the way he always made his feelings known, not directly, not to Ethan, but at the table, in a voice loud enough to carry everywhere it needed to go. "Grown men taking orders from a cook," he said to the man sitting next to him. "What's next? She picks the grazing rotation too." The table was quiet in the particular way it went quiet when Garrett was talking, and everyone knew Ethan was listening. Ethan was at the head of the table, cutting into his food, not looking up. "The cook found the mine shaft," he said, not loud, not sharp, just level. "The cook found the water. The cook was right about the trough 9 days before we lost cattle." He looked up then at Garrett specifically. "So yes, we're digging where she said to dig." Garrett's jaw tightened. He looked down at his plate. Abigail stood at the kitchen doorway with a serving dish in her hands and kept her face perfectly still. She did not look at Ethan. She did not look at Garrett. She walked to the table and set the dish down and walked back to the kitchen. But the young hand Cody caught her eye as she passed and gave her a small private nod. She allowed herself just briefly to breathe. They started digging the next morning. 12 men with pickaxes and shovels working in the summer heat on the east pasture, starting at the spot she had marked with a stake of cut willow branch pushed into the ground. She watched from the fence for 20 minutes before she went back to the kitchen because she had bread to bake and noon meal to prepare, and she had already given Ethan Callahan everything she had to give. What happened next was in the ground's hands. By late afternoon, they were 18 feet down. Nothing yet. Garrett came to the kitchen door at 4 o'clock, sweat-soaked, and carrying his expression like a weapon. 20 feet and still dry, he said. You gonna come tell the boss he wasted a day? I'll tell him whatever needs telling, she said. She didn't look up from the dough she was working. If there's no water by 30 feet, I was wrong about the depth. That's possible. Just wrong, period, Garrett said. Also possible, she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment, clearly wanting something from her anger or shame or backing down. She gave him none of those things. She kept working the dough. He left. At 6 o'clock in the evening, with the light going golden off the peaks and the last of the summer heat lifting slightly into something almost bearable. There was a shout from the east pasture. Abigail heard it in the kitchen. She set down her spoon. She untied her apron. She walked to the side door and stepped out onto the yard. The men were already climbing out of the dig site, and they were laughing, the loose, relieved kind of laughing that happens when a thing you desperately needed to be true turns out to be true. One of them, coming up the ladder, had water all the way to his boots, 23 feet down. She stood in the yard and watched them, and she felt something move through her chest. Not triumph exactly, more like the slow settling of something that had been held very carefully upright for a long time. Ethan came out of the group of men and walked toward the house. He stopped in front of her. He pulled off his hat and held it in both hands, not a gesture he made for anyone, she'd noticed that already. He only took his hat off when he was serious. You were right, he said. I'm glad, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I should have listened at the corral. You listened today, she said. That's what mattered. He looked down at his hat. He looked back up at her. I don't know your whole story, Miss Carter, he said. But I'd like to. She held his gaze. The evening light was behind him, and the shouts of the men carried on the air, and somewhere above the peaks, the first evening star was coming out. That might take some time, she said. I got time, he said. Long as you're staying. She looked at him steadily. She thought about 8 years of ranches and wrong-sided conversations and hands that worked without being seen. She thought about the mine shaft she'd found alone in the dark. She thought about a horse at a trough that wouldn't drink. I'm staying, she said. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He turned back toward his men. Abigail Carter turned back toward the kitchen. She did not smile until she was through the door. The morning after they struck water, Garrett didn't show up for breakfast. Abigail noticed it the way she noticed everything without making a show of noticing. 11 men at the table instead of 12. The chair at the far end empty. Nobody mentioned it, which meant everybody knew something she didn't yet. Cody came for a second helping of eggs and lingered at the kitchen window, the way he did when he had something to say, but wasn't sure she wanted to hear it. He's in the barn, Cody said quietly. Been there since before sunup. Is that unusual? She said. Garrett's always first to the table, Cody said. Never misses a meal in 3 years I've been here. She looked at the empty chair. She put more eggs on his plate and sent him back. She thought about Garrett and the way his jaw had tightened the night before when Ethan had spoken over him at the table. She thought about a man who had been on this ranch almost as long as Ethan himself, who had built his identity around knowing this land, and who had been proven wrong yesterday by the cook, not gently, not quietly, but in front of everyone in the middle of supper with water still dripping off the boots of the men who'd found it. She'd been proven right plenty of times in her life. She knew what it cost the people who'd been certain she was wrong. She finished the breakfast dishes and went to the barn. Garrett was working on a bridle that didn't need working on. His hands were moving the leather, turning over and over, but his eyes weren't on the work. He heard her come in, and his shoulders went rigid without him turning around. "I don't need company," he said. "I didn't bring any," she said. "Just me." She stood a few feet behind him and waited. She'd learned early in her life that you didn't push men like Garrett. You waited for the pressure that was already inside them to find its own direction. It took about 30 seconds. 11 years, he said. 11 years on this ranch, and I didn't see what you saw in 4 days. I wasn't looking at the same things you were looking at, she said. And what's that supposed to mean? You were looking at what you knew, she said. Drought, heat, low water, things you've seen before. I was looking at it fresh. Fresh eyes catch different things. That's not a skill. That's just being new. He turned around then. His face was doing something complicated, pride and something rawer than pride fighting each other for the same territory. The men are talking, he said. Men always talk, she said. They're saying you saved the ranch. She looked at him steadily. The well saved the ranch. You all dug it. Don't do that, he said, and his voice had an edge now, but it was a different edge than the one he'd been carrying around the table. This one was almost honest. Don't talk it down like it was nothing. I spent 9 days ignoring what you were saying, and 2 of Ethan's cattle died because of it. That's on me as much as on him. She was quiet for a moment. Then learn from it, she said, and stop making it so hard for someone to tell you something you don't already know. He stared at her. The complicated thing on his face settled slowly into something she might have called reluctant respect if she were being generous, and she decided to be generous because she needed this man working with her, not against her, and because underneath the pride and the bark, he was not, she thought, actually a bad man. You want some breakfast? She said. I kept a plate. A long pause. Yeah, he said finally. All right. He followed her out of the barn. He didn't say thank you, but he showed up to every meal for the rest of the week, and he never left that chair empty again. Word travels fast in ranch country, and by the end of the week, 3 neighboring ranch hands had ridden over to see the new well with their own eyes. Not because they cared about Callahan Ranch's water problem. Because Ethan Callahan's ranch had found water in the worst drought in a decade, and nobody could explain how, except to say the new cook had pointed at a patch of ground and said, dig here. The story mutated as it traveled the way stories do. By the time it reached the town of Harlan's Creek, 7 miles south, Abigail Carter had apparently used a willow branch to divine the water while reciting something under her breath that the hands couldn't quite make out. Cody told her this with obvious delight one evening while she was rolling out pie crust. I was not reciting anything, she said. I know that, he said, but it makes a better story. Better for who? She said. Better for you mostly, he said. People in town are curious about you. She pressed the rolling pin down firmly. I don't need people curious about me. I need people to let me do my job. Little late for that, ma'am, Cody said, and had the wisdom to take the piece of leftover dough she offered him and leave before she said anything else. She wasn't wrong to worry about the curiosity. Curiosity in her experience had 2 faces. One of them was friendly. The other one came looking for something to cut down. Wade Holloway came on a Thursday. She heard him before she saw him. A big voice carrying across the yard, the kind of voice that had never learned to adjust itself to the space it was in, because the spaces it moved through had always adjusted themselves to it instead. She was at the kitchen window, and she watched him ride in on a horse that cost more than most men in the territory made in a year, with 2 hands trailing behind him like punctuation. He was 45 years old and built like a man who had started strong and let comfort add to it. His hat was newer than it needed to be. His boots were cleaner than a working rancher's boots had any business being. Ethan came out of the house to meet him, and the 2 men shook hands. The way men shook hands when they had history that wasn't entirely good. Careful, correct, saying nothing with the grip that they weren't willing to say out loud. "Heard about your water situation resolving itself," Holloway said. His voice carried through the kitchen window without any effort. "Glad to hear it. Thought you might be in real trouble there for a while." "We found a solution," Ethan said. "So I heard." Holloway looked around the yard with the particular survey of a man who is assessing property he is thinking of acquiring. "Also heard you had some help from an unexpected source." "I've got good people on this ranch," Ethan said. Holloway's eyes moved toward the kitchen window, and Abigail stepped back from it, not quickly, but deliberately. "They're saying a woman found the water. Your cook." "That's right." A pause. A slight adjustment in Holloway's posture, barely visible, but she'd been reading posture her whole life. "Ethan," Holloway said, and his voice shifted into something that sounded like friendship, and was something else entirely. "You know, I've always had a high regard for you. Man who runs his ranch well. Man who makes sound decisions." "I appreciate that," Ethan said. "But you want to be careful," Holloway said, "letting the hired help make the calls. Especially—" Another pause, measured and deliberate. "A woman who's been here, 2 weeks? You don't know her history. You don't know what she's working toward. Women in situations like hers, they see opportunity and they take it." Ethan was quiet. "She found the water," he said finally. "That's all she did." Holloway said again. He had a particular way of using that sound that managed to express doubt and condescension and superior knowledge all at once, with one syllable. "Well, just something to keep in mind." He shifted his weight on his horse. "I actually came because I wanted to talk to you about the eastern boundary. There's a survey question that's come up that I think we should resolve before it becomes something bigger." They walked off together toward the main building, and their voices dropped below what she could hear. Abigail stood in the kitchen with her hands still. She thought about the way Holloway had looked at the window. She thought about the word opportunity and the way he'd placed it soft and pointed like a blade set down on a table rather than drawn. She thought about the fact that he'd told Ethan last month that the East Creek was naturally low, that Ethan's own management was causing his cattle losses. She went back to her work. But something had shifted in her understanding of the situation, and the shape it made was not a comfortable one. She told no one what she'd heard, but she started paying a different kind of attention. 2 days after Holloway's visit, she noticed one of his hands, a lean, sharp-faced man she'd seen trailing behind him on Thursday, riding the ridgeline above the east pasture. Not on Callahan land, technically. The ridgeline was the boundary. But he was riding it slowly back and forth the way a man rides something when he's measuring it. She mentioned it to Ethan at supper, not in front of the men. She waited until the table had cleared and came to him with the coffee pot and refilled his cup and said quietly, "One of Holloway's men was riding your east boundary today, up on the ridge." Ethan looked at her. "Doing what?" "Riding it slow," she said. "Back and forth. Maybe 4 passes that I saw." He was quiet for a moment. His coffee cup sat untouched. "How long were you watching?" he said. "About half an hour," she said. "I was hanging laundry." He nodded slowly. Something was moving behind his eyes that he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. "Thank you," he said. She went back to the kitchen. He sat at the table for a long time after. The first real fracture between them happened on a Sunday. It wasn't about Holloway. It wasn't about water or cattle or the mine shaft. It came out of nowhere the way the worst arguments do, from something so small that the small thing was clearly not what it was actually about. She had rearranged the feed storage in the barn. She'd done it because the arrangement was inefficient. The heavy grain bags stacked in a position that required 2 men to move them when one person could do it with a better layout. And beyond efficiency, the moisture exposure wasn't right, and she'd seen the early signs of mold in the bottom left corner that would cost real money if it wasn't addressed now. She moved it on a Saturday afternoon when the men were on the West Range. She worked for 2 hours, and when she finished, the layout was logical, and the mold risk was handled, and she'd found 3 bags that were already compromised and set them aside with a note on top explaining why. Ethan came in Sunday morning and found it. He found her at the kitchen table going over the meal plan for the week, and he came in through the side door, and he stood there for a moment, and she looked up and knew immediately from his face that something had gone wrong. "The barn," he said. "I reorganized the feed storage," she said. "There was mold starting in the—" "I know about the mold," he said, and his voice was tight in a way she hadn't heard from him. "Garrett spotted it last week. We had a plan to deal with it." "I didn't know that," she said. "Because you didn't ask," he said. The word landed differently than his tone warranted, and she felt the difference immediately. The particular sting of being told, "You should have asked when asking," hadn't ever been a model that worked for her in places like this. "You're right," she said, keeping her voice even. "I should have said something first." "This is my barn," he said. "These are my men. They have systems and they have ways of doing things, and when somebody moves things without talking to anybody first, it makes the work harder, not easier, because nobody knows where anything is." She looked at him. "The bags I set aside are the ones with mold," she said. "The ones on the left are the heaviest and are now closest to the door. The layout took 2 hours to change and will save 2 men 15 minutes of work every single day." She paused. "But I should have asked. I agree with that." He held her gaze. Some of the tightness in his jaw released not because the argument was over, but because she hadn't swung back at him and he'd been braced for her to. "I'm not," he started, stopped. "I'm not saying you were wrong about the layout." "I know," she said. "I'm saying this ranch runs on communication," he said. "If you see something, you tell me. You don't just do it." She thought about the corral fence. She thought about what happened when she told him things at the corral fence. She thought about 9 days and 2 dead cattle. She didn't say any of that. What she said was, "That's fair. I'll remember it." He stood there for another moment, as if he expected something more, an argument, a defense, an explanation that made him wrong instead of her. She didn't give him one. He nodded short and final the way he made decisions and left. She sat at the table for a long moment after the side door closed. She pressed her hands flat on the surface and breathed in and breathed out, and let the particular loneliness of being exactly right in exactly the wrong way move through her and settle. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the meal plan. That evening, Cody came in for coffee and sat at the kitchen table without being invited, which he'd started doing regularly, and which she'd stopped pretending to mind. "Heard he came in here after the barn," Cody said. "You hear everything," she said. "Ranch is small," he said. "What did he say?" "He was right," she said. "I should have talked to him first." Cody wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "You know what I think? I think you're going to tell me regardless," she said. "He's not mad about the barn," Cody said. "He's scared." She looked at him. "Of what?" Cody thought about it the way young people thought about things honestly, without the layers adults learned to put over their honesty. "Of how fast things change when you're around," he said. 3 weeks ago, this ranch had bad water and dying cattle and no answers. Now we got a well, we got Garrett actually listening at table, we got the men talking different." He paused. "He built everything here himself, alone, for 11 years. And in 3 weeks, you come in and you see things he didn't see and fix things he didn't fix, and he doesn't know what to do with that, except get mad about a barn." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a very perceptive thing for someone your age to say," she said. "My mama was a smart woman," he said simply. "She taught me to watch people." Abigail poured him more coffee. "Then you'll do well out here." He smiled that boyish smile and took the cup and said nothing else, and she was grateful for that because she needed to sit with what he'd told her and she didn't want to do it out loud. The second twist came from a direction she hadn't been watching. A letter arrived from the county land office on a Wednesday, delivered by a rider who handed it to Garrett and rode on without stopping for water, which was the first unusual thing. Garrett brought it to Ethan, and Ethan read it at the table in the main room, with his hat still on, which he never did. And when he set it down, his face had gone to a place she hadn't seen before. Not angry, not troubled, but quiet, in the particular way that meant something had hit something structural. She was moving through the main room with a cleaning cloth, and she slowed without stopping. Garrett said, "What is it?" Ethan said, "The county assessor's office is saying there's a boundary dispute on the east pasture. Says the survey line runs 50 feet west of where we've always understood it to be." The room was quiet. "That's Holloway's call," Garrett said. It wasn't a question. "The letter's from the county," Ethan said, "but the complaint was filed by an adjacent landowner." He folded the letter. "Yes, it's Holloway." Garrett's jaw tightened in the old way, the pre-breakfast conversation way. He can't just redraw the boundary. "He's not redrawing it," Ethan said. "He's saying the original survey was wrong, that the line was never where we put our fence." Abigail had stopped moving. She stood with the cleaning cloth in her hands and thought about a lean, sharp-faced man riding the ridgeline back and forth, slow and deliberate, measuring something. "The east pasture," she said. Both men looked at her. "That's where the new well is," she said. "If the boundary moves 50 feet west, the well moves with it." The silence that followed was the kind that came when something clicked into place that should have been obvious earlier, but wasn't. And the not seeing it earlier was its own kind of blow. Ethan looked at her. His eyes had gone to that storm-gray place again, but the weather in them now was not uncertainty. It was something colder and more decided. "Yes," he said, "it is." Garrett said something under his breath that she chose not to hear. Then he said at full volume, "He told you last month your own management was killing the cattle. He sent a man to ride the ridge, and now this." "He didn't expect us to fix the water problem," Ethan said slowly. "He expected the drought to break us. And when it didn't, he moved to take the ground that solved it," Abigail said. Ethan looked at her steadily. "We need the original survey documents." "Where are they?" she said. "In a box in my office," he said, "where they've been for 11 years because I never had reason to open them." "Then we open them now," she said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he stood. "Garrett, get the men together. Nobody rides the east pasture today. Nobody does anything near that boundary until I understand exactly where it legally sits." Garrett moved. Abigail set down the cleaning cloth and followed Ethan to his office. The survey documents were in a tin box under a stack of ledger books that hadn't been touched in years. Ethan pulled it out and set it on his desk and opened it. And inside were papers that were yellowed and stiff at the folds, a surveyor's report from 1871, a hand-drawn map with measurements noted in faded ink, and a series of correspondence letters between the original land office and the man who'd owned the ranch before Ethan. She stood beside him while he spread the surveyor's map on the desk. She looked at the hand-drawn lines. She looked at the measurements. She looked at the reference points used to establish the survey, a creek bend, a rock formation, a stand of trees. "The creek bend," she said. He looked at where she was pointing. "The survey used the creek bend on the east boundary as a fixed point," she said. "But the creeks moved. Drought does that to creek beds, they shift. If the bend has shifted even 20 feet in 50 years, the boundary reference point shifts with it," he said. "Holloway knows this," she said. "That's why his man was measuring the ridge. He wasn't measuring where the boundary is. He was measuring where the creek bend used to be." Ethan straightened. He pressed both hands flat on the desk and looked at the map, and she could see the whole shape of it assembling in his mind the way it had assembled in hers. The creek, the contamination, the timing of Holloway's visit, the letter from the county, the new well sitting 50 feet inside a boundary that Holloway was now claiming had always been his. "He knew about the mine shaft," Ethan said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I think he's known for a long time," she said. "He let my cattle die," Ethan said. She said nothing. Some things didn't need adding to. He stood there for a long moment, with his hands on the map. Then he looked at her. "I need a lawyer," he said. "The circuit judge comes through Harlan's Creek next month." "That might not be fast enough," she said carefully. "If Holloway files a formal claim with the county before you contest it, there's a process that takes time, and during that time, the boundary becomes legally ambiguous and he can make a case to freeze use of anything in the disputed area," Ethan said, "including the well." "Yes," she said. He held her gaze. The lines around his eyes had deepened in the last few minutes, and she thought about what Cody had said, that he'd built everything here alone for 11 years, and that she'd changed things fast. And she thought that what she was looking at right now was a man who had never asked for help with anything, and who was realizing that the size of what was coming at him was larger than what he could meet alone. "What would you do?" he said. It was the first time he'd asked her that. Not what she'd noticed, not what she'd found, not what she thought had happened. What she would do. She felt the weight of it, and she didn't set it down. "I'd ride to Harlan's Creek tomorrow," she said. "Not to the lawyer first, to the land office. I'd get them to pull the original county survey records, not Holloway's copy the county's. And I'd bring someone who can read survey documents and testify to what they say." She paused. "And I'd do it before Holloway has any reason to think you've read that letter and understood what it means." He watched her for a long, still moment. "Can you read survey documents?" he said. "My father was a surveyor for 6 years before he farmed," she said. "Yes." Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the particular feeling of a man who keeps reaching for a wall and finding a door. "Garrett'll have to run things here while I'm gone," he said. "Garrett can do that," she said. "He's a good foreman when he's not defending territory." The corner of Ethan's mouth moved, just slightly. "You want to ride to Harlan's Creek with me?" he said. "I want you to solve this problem," she said. "If riding to Harlan's Creek with you helps, then yes." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded once in that final way. "We ride at first light," he said. She nodded back and went to the kitchen to prepare what she needed to leave behind for the men's breakfast, because there was a ranch to feed and a legal fight to start, and she had learned a long time ago that you did both at the same time, or neither got done right. Behind her she could hear Ethan calling for Garrett, and the sound of boots crossing the floor, and the particular quality of a conversation that had moved from crisis to plan, and she thought just briefly that the ranch felt different than it had 3 weeks ago. Not fixed, not safe, but pointed in a direction, which in her experience was the thing that mattered most. They rode out before the sun cleared the peaks. Ethan had the survey documents in his saddlebag rolled tight in oilcloth, the way a man carried things he couldn't afford to lose. Abigail rode beside him on her bay mare, not behind him, and he hadn't suggested otherwise, which she noted and filed away alongside everything else she was learning about who he was when he wasn't defending what he thought he already knew. Garrett stood in the yard and watched them go. He didn't say anything. But he'd been up before either of them, she knew, because when she'd come to the kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, there was already coffee on and a lamp lit, and that was Garrett's way of saying what he couldn't bring himself to say with words. The ride to Harlan's Creek took just under 2 hours, and they spent the first 40 minutes of it in silence, which was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that two people settled into when they both understood that what was ahead of them required thought, not conversation. Then Ethan said, "Tell me what you know about survey law," she told him. She laid it out the way her father had laid it out for her over years of listening. The way fixed points worked, the way natural landmarks created problems because they moved or changed or disappeared. The way courts in territory disputes generally favored the oldest documented evidence when the physical landmarks no longer matched the paperwork. She told him about the creek bend and what it meant legally that the survey used it as a reference. She told him what she thought Holloway's argument would be, and where it was strong and where it wasn't. He listened without interrupting, which was not nothing. Most men interrupted. When she finished, he said, "How do you know Holloway's argument?" "Because it's the argument I'd make if I were him," she said. The creek bend shifted. The original survey reference point no longer exists in the same location. He'll argue that the boundary should be recalculated from the current position of the bend, which moves the line west by roughly 50 feet. And our argument, that the survey was never about the creek bend's current position, she said. It was about the creek bend's position in 1871 when the survey was drawn. The boundary is where it was established, not where the creek decided to move 50 years later. The land didn't move. The water did. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That's a clean argument. It's a true argument, she said. Clean and true usually travel together. He looked at her sidelong. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. You ever been in a courthouse? He said. Once, she said. My father contested a fence line when I was 12. He won. Because of his argument. Because he had better documents, she said. Arguments matter less than people think. Documents matter more. He looked ahead at the trail. Then let's hope the county kept good records. Let's hope Holloway didn't get there first, she said. The county land office in Harlan's Creek was run by a man named Elbert Pruitt, who wore his authority the way small men in small offices often did, carefully, conspicuously with both hands. He was behind his desk when they came in, and he looked up over his spectacles with the particular expression of a man who had been expecting something unpleasant and was not disappointed to see it arriving on schedule. Mr. Callahan, he said. He looked at Abigail. He looked back at Ethan. What can I do for you? It was not a question. I need the original county survey records for the eastern boundary of my property, Ethan said. The 1871 survey, not the assessment copy. The county's original. Pruitt's hands moved on his desk without picking anything up. May I ask what this is regarding? A boundary dispute, Ethan said. One that was filed against my property by an adjacent landowner. I assume you know about it since the letter came from this office. Mr. Holloway did file a formal inquiry, Pruitt said, picking his words the way men picked their footing on uncertain ground. I wouldn't characterize it as a dispute yet. He characterized it as a boundary dispute in the letter, Ethan said. I'd like the original survey records. Pruitt looked at Abigail again. And this is Miss Carter, Ethan said. She's with me. A pause. Pruitt removed his spectacles and cleaned them with his shirt, which she'd learned to recognize as the gesture men made when they were buying themselves time to decide something they'd already decided. The 1871 survey records are in the archive, he said. I'd need some time to locate them. We'll wait, Ethan said. Another pause, longer this time. Mr. Callahan, Pruitt said, and his voice had shifted into something lower and more deliberate. Mr. Holloway is a significant landowner in this county, a significant contributor to various concerns in this county. I want you to understand that a formal contest is something that takes time and resources and doesn't always resolve the way people expect it to. The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he said very evenly, Are you telling me you won't pull the records? I'm telling you to be thoughtful, Pruitt said. Ethan put both hands on the desk and leaned forward slightly and said in the same even voice, Pull the records, Mr. Pruitt. Pruitt looked at him. He looked at Abigail. He put his spectacles back on and stood and went to the back room without another word. Abigail stood beside Ethan and kept her face still. When Pruitt's footsteps had gone far enough, she said quietly, He's going to send word to Holloway. I know, Ethan said, equally quiet. We might have less time than we thought. I know that too, he said. Let's get what we came for. Pruitt came back with a document box that he set on the counter with the careful emphasis of a man who wanted it, understood that he was being cooperative under protest. Abigail stepped forward before Ethan could, and Pruitt's expression shifted in the way men's expressions shifted when a woman reached for something official, a small tightening, a readiness to correct. She opened the box. Inside were the original survey documents, not just the 1871 report, but a series of correspondence and field notes that had been filed with it. She lifted them out carefully and laid them on the counter and began to read. Pruitt said, "Those are county property, miss. They're not—" "I'm reading them," she said without looking up. "Not taking them." He made a sound. He didn't stop her. She read quickly but thoroughly, the way her father had taught her. Start with the field notes, not the final report, because the final report is what the surveyor wanted the record to show, and the field notes are what actually happened. The notes were written in the cramped hand of a man working outdoors with measurements taken and renoted and occasionally crossed out and corrected. The creek bend was there, referenced 3 times in the field notes as a fixed landmark, but in the margin of the third reference in slightly different ink added later, she thought there was a notation she almost missed. She stopped. "Ethan," she said. He came to stand beside her. She pointed to the marginal notation without touching the paper. He read it. He read it again. "What does that say?" He said, though she thought he knew. "It says the surveyor noted the creek bend position as of that date and marked it with a cairn," she said. "A pile of stones, at the base of the east slope 6 feet from the bend, placed there specifically to preserve the reference point in case the creek shifted." Ethan looked at her. "If that cairn is still there," she said. "It's physical evidence of where the bend was in 1871, he said. "And it's not affected by where the creek moved," she said. "It's a fixed marker, intentionally placed to survive exactly this kind of dispute." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before. This was not the silence of uncertainty. This was the silence of something clicking into place so firmly that the sound of it was almost physical. Pruitt, who had been standing behind the counter with his arms crossed, uncrossed them. Something had shifted in his expression too, though he was working to keep it neutral. "I want a copy of these field notes," Ethan said to him. "Official copy, witnessed and stamped." "That process takes—" "How long?" Ethan said. A pause. "An hour," Pruitt said. "At minimum. Then we'll be back in an hour," Ethan said. "And the records stay in this office and stay exactly as they are until I come back for that copy." He looked at Pruitt steadily. "I hope that's understood." Pruitt held his gaze. Then he looked down. "Understood," he said. They found the lawyer before they found lunch. His name was Thomas Aldridge, and he operated out of a 2-room office above the dry goods store, and he was the only attorney within 40 miles who wasn't already on retainer to one of the 3 major landowners in the county. A fact Ethan knew, because he'd asked the liveryman when they tied their horses, and liverymen knew everything worth knowing. Aldridge was 50, thin in the way men went thin when they worked with their minds instead of their bodies, with careful eyes, and the habit of listening with his whole face, instead of just his ears. He heard Ethan's account of the boundary dispute without interrupting, and when Ethan was done, he said, "The cairn." "It's in the field notes," Abigail said. Aldridge looked at her. "And you read the field notes?" "I did," she said. "Can you interpret them in legal terms, I mean? Can you speak to what they say about the survey methodology?" "My father surveyed land for 6 years," she said. "I can read a survey document and I can explain what I read." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan. "She'd make a better witness than you," he said. "I know," Ethan said. Aldridge leaned back in his chair. "The cairn is the key. If it's there, if it's still there and identifiable, that's your case. Physical evidence of the 1871 reference point that predates any claim about the creek's movement." He paused. "If it's not there, or if someone has moved it, then we need to establish it from the field notes alone," Abigail said. "Which is possible, but harder." Aldridge looked at her again with that careful look. "Who are you?" he said. Not rudely, genuinely. "The cook at Callahan Ranch," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Well, I've had worse clients." He looked at Ethan. "I'll take the case. My fee is $15, and I'll need a week to file the formal response before Holloway's claim can be acted on." You need to find that cairn, and you need to find it before he does." "He doesn't know it exists," Abigail said. "He will," Aldridge said, "the moment Pruitt finishes telling him about your visit this morning, which I estimate happened about 30 minutes ago." He stood and picked up his hat. "So if I were you, I'd be riding back to that east slope this afternoon." They got back to the ranch in the early evening, and Ethan called the men together in the yard before supper. He didn't make a speech. He laid it out the same way he did everything short direct without decoration. "Holloway is claiming 50 feet of our east pasture," he said, "including the new well. There's a stone cairn on the east slope that was placed by the original surveyor in 1871. If it's still there, it proves the boundary line. I need it found before Holloway finds out it exists." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Garrett said, "He's going to come for it if he finds out." "Yes," Ethan said. "Then we find it first," Garrett said, and something in his voice had settled into a place that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. Not deference, because Garrett wasn't built for deference, but something adjacent to it, something that came from a man who had been wrong in a significant way and had thought about it and decided to stand differently. "First light," Ethan said. "All hands on the slope." The men nodded and dispersed, and Abigail went to the kitchen to get supper on, and for a moment, the ordinary motion of it, the fire, the cast iron, the sound of the men moving around the yard outside, felt strangely fragile, as if the whole shape of the ranch's life was being held up by something that hadn't been found yet. They found the cairn the next morning, or rather Abigail found it. The men had spread across the slope in a line working east to west, and she was at the south end of the line, moving slowly, reading the ground, the way she'd read the ground when she'd found the mine shaft and the water vein, not looking for what should be there, but watching for what was actually there. The slight differences in how the earth sat, the way stones lay when human hands had placed them, versus the way they lay when water or frost or time had moved them. She found it 40 feet from the current creek bank. A pile of stones, not large, maybe 18 inches high, the kind that could be mistaken for a natural feature by anyone who wasn't looking for it. But the stones were placed not fallen. She could see the deliberateness of it, the way the bottom layer was flat, and the upper stones were chosen for fit the work of someone who intended this thing to last. She called out. Not loudly. She didn't shout. She said, "Here," in a carrying voice, and then crouched beside the cairn and waited. Ethan reached her first. He crouched beside her and looked at it and pressed his hand against the base stones the way she'd pressed her hand to the ground over the water vein, feeling for something real. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. He looked up at her. The morning light was full on his face, and something in his expression was open in a way she hadn't seen before. Not grateful exactly, though that was part of it. More like the look of a man who had just understood that he had been carrying something heavier than he knew, and that the weight had just shifted. "Abigail," he said. Her first name. The first time he'd used it. She held his gaze and didn't look away. "I know," she said. He nodded. He stood and turned to call for Garrett, and the men came and the cairn was documented and measured, and Cody was sent to Harlan's Creek with a written account for Aldridge before noon. Holloway came that afternoon. He didn't send a letter this time, and he didn't bring 2 hands trailing behind him like punctuation. He came with 4 men, and he came fast, and he rode straight into the yard the way men rode into places they intended to own, and Ethan was standing on the porch when he arrived, and Garrett was at the barn, and most of the hands were in visible positions around the yard, because Garrett had placed them there an hour ago, when the rider on the ridge, the same lean, sharp-faced man, had been spotted moving fast south toward Holloway's property. Abigail was at the kitchen window. "Callahan," Holloway said. "He didn't get down from his horse." "Holloway," Ethan said. He didn't move from the porch. "You were in the land office this morning." "I was. And now I'm hearing something about a cairn on my survey line." "On my survey line?" Ethan said. "Yes." Holloway's jaw moved. He was a man who was very accustomed to situations going the way he directed them to go, and the particular tension of a situation that was not going that way yet was visible in every line of his body. "I want to see it," Holloway said. "No," Ethan said. A beat of silence. "I beg your pardon," Holloway said. "The cairn is physical evidence in a legal boundary dispute," Ethan said. "My lawyer has already filed documentation with the county. Until the dispute is resolved by the court, nobody goes near that slope without my foreman present, including you." He paused. "Especially you." Holloway looked at him for a long moment. His 4 men were very still. Garrett and the hands were very still. The yard held a particular kind of silence that had edges. "You're going to make this difficult," Holloway said. "I'm going to let the law handle it," Ethan said. "Which is what the law is for." Holloway shifted his weight. His eyes moved from Ethan to Garrett to the men around the yard doing the arithmetic, and she could see the moment when the arithmetic came back with an answer he didn't like. Then his eyes moved to the kitchen window. She didn't step back. He looked at her for a long moment. And what crossed his face then was not quite anger. It was something colder. Recognition, recalculation, the look of a man who had underestimated a variable and was adjusting his model. He looked back at Ethan. "You've got yourself quite a cook," he said. His voice was light. The lightness was the most dangerous thing about it. "Yes," Ethan said. "I do." Holloway turned his horse and rode out. His men followed. The yard stayed silent until they were past the gate and down the trail, and then Garrett let out a long breath, and the men around the yard seemed to deflate slightly from whatever they'd been holding. Ethan came down off the porch and walked to the kitchen door and opened it. Abigail was already at the stove. "He'll try something else," she said without turning. "I know," Ethan said. "The court date is 4 weeks out," she said. 4 weeks is a long time." "Yes," he said. He came inside and closed the door and stood for a moment in the kitchen, which was unusual because he almost never came into the kitchen. "Are you all right?" She looked at him then. "Am I?" She stopped. "Yes, I'm all right." "He looked at you," Ethan said. "At the window. He knows you were involved in finding the documents." "I expected that," she said. "I don't want him deciding you're the problem he needs to solve," Ethan said, and his voice had gone to a very quiet place. The place voices went when they were carrying something the speaker hadn't intended to put down in words and had put down anyway. She held his gaze. "I've been the problem men needed to solve before," she said. "I'm still here." He looked at her for a moment. The kitchen was warm and close, and the late afternoon light came through the small window and fell across the flowers she'd left on the board, and none of it was the kind of thing that should have felt significant, and all of it did. "I know you are," he said. He took his hat off and held it in both hands. "But this is different. Holloway isn't a man who argues and gives up. He's a man who lets things get complicated until the other side runs out of money or patience or both," she said. "I know." "And he knows the circuit judge," Ethan said. "Aldridge told me. They're not friends, but they have history." She absorbed that. It added weight to a thing that already had weight. "Is Aldridge worried?" she said. "He said it's manageable," Ethan said. He said with the cairn and the field notes and a clear argument about the fixed point methodology, we have a strong case. "But," she said. He looked at his hat. "But he said Holloway has filed 4 boundary disputes in this county in the last 8 years. He's won 3 of them." The kitchen was very quiet. "What happened to the one he lost?" she said. "The other party had a federal land grant that superseded the county survey entirely," Ethan said. "The county judge couldn't override it." She stood very still. Something was moving in the back of her mind. A memory. Something her father had told her. Something about the legal hierarchy of land claims in territory that had passed from federal jurisdiction to state. "The original purchase of this ranch," she said slowly. "How was it acquired?" Ethan looked at her. "Bought from the previous owner." "And the previous owner?" "Homestead claim," Ethan said. "Filed in 1868. Filed with the Federal Land Office," she said. He was watching her now. Federal homestead claims, she said, are registered in the Federal Land Office records, not just the county records. And the boundary descriptions in a federal homestead filing are fixed at the time of the federal survey, which predates and supersedes the county survey. If the federal filing has the boundary, he said slowly, then Holloway's county-level dispute doesn't touch it, she said. He'd have to file a federal challenge, which is a different process entirely, in a different court, with a different judge. Ethan stared at her. Do you know if the federal records still have the original homestead filing? She said. I don't know, he said. I don't have a copy of the federal filing. I don't know if the previous owner... There would be a copy in the National Land Office, she said. In Helena or Washington. Ethan put his hat back on. He did it the way he put his hat on when he was going somewhere and moving fast. Aldridge, he said. Aldridge, she agreed. He moved to the door and stopped and looked back at her. How do you know about federal homestead filings? He said. She picked up a spoon and went back to the pot on the stove. My father contested a fence line when I was 12, she said. He won because he had better documents. A pause. You said that before, he said. It bears repeating, she said. He almost smiled. She heard it in the pause even though she wasn't looking at him. Then he went out the door at the kind of pace that meant he was already 2 steps into the next problem, and she stirred the pot and let herself feel just briefly the particular and complicated satisfaction of a woman who had laid the right piece of information in front of the right person at exactly the right moment. Aldridge sent a telegram to Helena that evening. The response came back 48 hours later, hand-delivered by the same writer who'd brought the original dispute letter, which Ethan noted with a look that said he was storing that piece of information for later consideration. He opened the telegram at the kitchen table, which had become somewhere in the last 2 weeks the place where the real decisions got made. Abigail was across the table with the meal plan, and Garrett was in the doorway, and Cody was technically just getting coffee, but had stopped moving when Ethan opened the envelope. Ethan read it. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table and pushed it toward Abigail without a word. She picked it up. The Federal Land Office in Helena confirmed the existence of the original homestead filing for the property that was now Callahan Ranch, filed September 14, 1868. Boundary description on file. The east boundary was described by meets and bounds, a legal description that used distances and directions, not natural landmarks, making it immune to the creek shift argument entirely. The federal filing showed the east boundary of the property sitting 62 feet east of where Holloway claimed the county survey put it, 12 feet beyond the disputed zone. The new well sat inside the federal boundary by 12 feet. The kitchen was very quiet. Garrett said, "Is that what I think it is?" "Yes," Abigail said. "He's got nothing," Garrett said. "He's got a county-level argument that doesn't hold up against a federal filing," she said, "which is different from nothing. He can still fight it, but he'd have to go federal, and a federal challenge to a homestead claim is expensive and slow and very hard to win without evidence of fraud in the original filing." "Which doesn't exist," Ethan said. "Which doesn't exist," she agreed. Ethan looked at her across the table. His eyes were very still and very clear. The storm in them settled into something that was almost calm. "You found the mine shaft," he said. "You found the water. You read the survey notes. You found the cairn. You thought of the federal filing." She held his gaze steadily. "You dug the well," she said. "Your men found the cairn. Your lawyer filed the papers." "Abigail," he said, and her name in his voice had a weight now that it hadn't had the first time he'd used it on the slope. She set the telegram down on the table. "Let's win the case first," she said quietly. "Then we can talk about who did what." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and picked up the telegram. But Cody, standing by the stove with his coffee cup, caught her eye over Ethan's shoulder, and the look on his young face was the look of someone watching something inevitable arrive. She looked away before he could see her expression match it. Aldridge filed the federal documentation with the county court on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon, the news had moved through Harlan's Creek The way news moved through small towns faster than horses, quieter than wind, and completely unstoppable. By Saturday, 3 men had ridden out to Callahan Ranch on separate pretexts, one needing to borrow a tool, one asking about cattle prices, one claiming he'd taken a wrong turn that nobody believed for a second. And each of them had spent 20 minutes in the yard talking to whoever would talk to them, and looking around with the careful eyes of people recalibrating something they'd thought they understood. Abigail watched them from the kitchen window and said nothing. Garrett watched them from the barn and said to nobody in particular, words out. Cody, who was never far from the kitchen in the evenings, said to Abigail, "People are going to want to know about you now." "People can want what they like," she said. "That's not really how it works out here," he said. "When Holloway loses something, people pay attention to who made him lose it, and then they come looking." She turned from the window. "Looking for what?" Cody thought about it. "I don't know exactly," he said, "but it ain't nothing good mostly." She went back to the stove. But she thought about what he'd said for the rest of that evening, and it sat in her chest like a stone that hadn't decided yet which direction it was going to fall. Holloway's next move came on a Tuesday, and it didn't come at the ranch. It came at church. Abigail had not attended services in Harlan's Creek since she arrived. She'd had no reason to, and no particular invitation. But Ethan went most Sundays and took 2 or 3 of the men with him. The same rotation each week, and on the Tuesday in question, Cody came back from a supply run with a tight expression and took longer than usual to unload the wagon. She found him at the wagon when the unloading had gone suspiciously slow for 30 minutes. "What happened in town?" she said. He didn't look up from the crate he was moving. "Nothing." "Cody." He stopped moving. He set the crate down and looked at her with the expression of someone who'd been trying to find a way to not say something and had run out of runway. "Mrs. Alderton, the preacher's wife, she was talking after the Tuesday market," he said. "About you." Abigail kept her voice even. "What did she say?" "That a woman who moves from ranch to ranch without a husband is—" He stopped, started again. "That a woman with no family and no roots, who inserts herself into a man's affairs and his property disputes and his chumya." Another stop. His jaw was tight. "She said some things I don't want to repeat to you, ma'am. And people were listening." She stood very still. "Did she say where she heard it?" she said. "She didn't have to," Cody said. "Her husband does the banking for half the county, and Holloway's ranch has a significant account at that bank." The stone in her chest picked its direction and fell. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Miss Carter?" He finally looked at her directly. His young face was angry in the clean, uncomplicated way that young people got angry before life taught them to fold it up smaller. "It ain't right." "No," she said. "It isn't." "What are you going to do?" She picked up the crate he'd set down. "I'm going to finish unloading this wagon," she said, "and then I'm going to start supper." "That's it," he said. "That's what I can do right now," she said. "So that's what I'm going to do." She carried the crate to the storage room and set it down and stood in the cool dark for exactly 60 seconds with her hands pressed flat against the wooden shelf and her eyes closed. Then she went to start supper. Oh, she did not tell Ethan. She told herself it was because there was nothing he could do about it. A woman talking after Tuesday market was not something a man could ride to town and fix, and the attempt would only give the story more air. She told herself the smart move was to wait to let the legal case speak, to let time do what time did, to stories that had no foundation under them. She believed most of that. The part she didn't entirely believe she kept in the same place. She kept everything she wasn't ready to look at directly. But Ethan found out anyway because Ethan Callahan had been running a ranch for 11 years, and he knew his men, and he could read Cody's face the way Abigail could read survey documents thoroughly accurately and with an understanding of what the small details were actually saying. He found her after supper when the men had cleared out and the kitchen was quiet. He came in and sat at the table and put his hat on the surface in front of him and looked at it. "Cody told me," he said. She kept her hands in the wash basin. I thought he might. Why didn't you? His voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of a man who was genuinely asking. She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I didn't want you to do something about it, she said. And I knew you'd want to. You were right about that, he said. I know. A pause. The fire in the stove settled. I could talk to Reverend Alderton, he said. And say what? She said, turning to look at him. That his wife shouldn't have opinions about the cook at Callahan Ranch. She'll have them anyway. Everyone will have them. The only question is what they're based on. Right now, they're based on what Holloway is feeding them, he said. Right now, she agreed. But if we win the case, when we win the case, he said. She looked at him. When we win the case, she said with a slight emphasis that acknowledged the correction. The story changes, and a story built on what Holloway paid the preacher's wife to say is not a story that survives a federal land ruling. Ethan looked at his hat. He picked it up and turned it in his hands and set it down again. This isn't right, he said, and the simplicity of it, the directness, the lack of hedging, made it hit differently than she expected. No, she said. It isn't. You came here to work, he said. You found the water. You found the boundary evidence. He stopped, pressed his hands flat on the table. They're talking about you like you're something to be suspicious of, and I put you in this position. She turned fully from the basin and dried her hands and looked at him. You hired me to cook, she said. The rest was my own choices. I chose to go look at the mine shaft. I chose to ride to Harlan's Creek. I chose to read those survey notes. She paused. Nobody put me anywhere I didn't walk into myself. He looked up at her. Something in his expression was working very hard at something. You could leave, he said. After the case, or before it. I'd understand it. The kitchen went very quiet. She held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about 8 years of ranches. She thought about the particular tiredness of being someone who understood things about land and water and animals that the people around her didn't credit because of what she was. She thought about all the places she'd worked where she'd been right and silent, and eventually moved on, because moving on was easier than staying in a place that would never quite hold her weight. She thought about a horse at a trough that wouldn't drink, and a willow stake in the ground, and a cairn made by a man who'd understood that someday someone would need to find it. I'm not leaving, she said. He held her gaze. The something in his expression stopped working so hard, and settled into something quieter and more decided. All right, he said. She turned back to the basin. The case is in 3 weeks, she said. Between now and then, it would help if you let Aldridge know about the preacher's wife and where the conversation came from. Not to stop it, just so he understands the shape of what Holloway's doing. Already planning to ride to town in the morning, Ethan said. Good, she said. He stood and picked up his hat. He stood for a moment longer than leaving required. Abigail, he said. She kept her hands in the basin. I know. She said the same way she'd said it on the slope when he'd spoken her name the first time. A pause. Then the sound of his boots crossing the kitchen floor and the side door opening and closing. She let out a slow breath. She did not let herself think about what she knew, or what he knew, or what the kitchen had felt like in the last 30 seconds. She finished the washing up and banked the fire and went to bed. She slept better than she had in 2 weeks. She did not examine that too closely either. The next twist arrived not from Holloway's direction, but from the ground itself. 10 days before the court date, one of the hands found something at the edge of the east pasture near the mine shaft not far from the cairn. He came into the yard holding something wrapped in his bandana and looking like a man who wasn't sure if he'd found treasure or trouble. He found Ethan first. Ethan called for Abigail. She unwrapped the bandana on the kitchen table. Inside was a piece of metal corroded and bent but identifiable. A survey marker stake. Old iron, the kind used by federal surveyors in the 1860s with a flattened head where an identification number had been stamped. The number was still readable. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Ethan. "This is a federal survey marker," she said. "These were placed by the General Land Office. They used them to mark section corners and boundary references in the original territorial surveys." "Before the county survey," Ethan said. "Years before," she said. "If this corresponds to the boundary description in the federal homestead filing." She stopped because the full weight of what she was holding was arriving in stages, and she needed to let each stage settle. "It predates everything Holloway is arguing from," Ethan said. "By at least 3 years," she said. "And federal survey markers are legally superior to county survey references. If we can match this marker's number to the federal records, we don't just have a defense," Ethan said. "We have proof," she said. "Not interpretation. Not a legal argument about which survey takes precedence. Physical, numbered, documented proof of exactly where the federal government said this boundary was." They looked at each other across the kitchen table with the old iron stake between them. "Where did he find it?" she said. "At the base of the slope," Ethan said. "Half buried. He almost rode past it." "It's been there since the 1860s, she said. "Sitting in the ground for 60 years waiting." Ethan's jaw moved. "Holloway's man was on that ridge measuring," he said. "If he'd found this, he might have moved it," she said. The word landed between them and neither of them picked it up right away, because what it implied was large and serious, and they both understood it without having to say it. "Aldridge needs to see this today," she said. "I'll ride now," Ethan said. He picked up the marker, carefully rewrapped it. He looked at her. "You should come." "I'll come," she said without hesitation this time. Aldridge held the marker under his lamp for a long time without speaking. He turned it over. He read the number twice. He set it on his desk and sat back and pressed his fingertips together and looked at the ceiling. "Do you understand what this is?" he said finally. "A federal survey marker," Abigail said. "Section reference for the original territorial survey. It's not just a federal survey marker," Aldridge said. He looked at them with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something between excitement and deliberate calm. The look of a man keeping a controlled fire from becoming an uncontrolled one. "The number on this marker, I need to verify it against the federal records. But if it corresponds to what I think it corresponds to, this marker predates the county survey by 4 years and establishes the boundary at a point that is not 50 feet west of your fence, Mr. Callahan. It is 11 feet east of your fence." Ethan went very still. "Say that again," he said. "Your fence is already inside the boundary this marker establishes," Aldridge said. "If this is what I think it is, Holloway hasn't just been lying about where the boundary is. He's been grazing cattle on Callahan land for years." The office was completely silent. Abigail felt something move through her that she didn't have an immediate name for. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something older and more structural than either of those things, like a wall that had been leaning for a long time, finally finding its true vertical. "How long to verify the marker number?" she said. "I can send a telegram to Helena tonight," Aldridge said. "We'll have confirmation within 48 hours." He looked at Ethan. "But I want you to hear me very clearly. If this confirms what I believe, the scope of this case changes. We're no longer defending a boundary. We're establishing that Holloway has been in unauthorized use of your property. That has legal implications that go well beyond a line on a map. He let the mine shaft poison my water," Ethan said quietly. "He told me my own management was killing my cattle. He filed a false boundary claim." "Yes," Aldridge said. "And if we can prove the last one with this marker, the first two become part of a pattern that a federal judge will want to look at very carefully." Ethan looked at Abigail. She looked back at him. "Send the telegram," Ethan said. "Blank. The 48 hours before confirmation arrived were the strangest 2 days Abigail had spent on the ranch. The men knew something had shifted. They could read Ethan the way men who worked closely with someone learned to read them in the set of his shoulders, and the pace of his walk, and the particular quality of his silences. They didn't know what had shifted, but they were careful and alert in the way working men got careful when they understood that something large was in motion. Garrett came to her on the second afternoon. He didn't come to the kitchen. He found her at the east fence, where she was checking the water level in the new well, a habit she'd developed daily measurement keeping records in a small notebook. He stood beside her and looked at the well and said, "It's going to hold." "Yes," she said. "We've had 4 days without significant drop. The vein is consistent." He nodded. They were quiet for a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it the way men like Garrett said such things directly, uncomfortably, without softening. "From the beginning, from the corral, from the table, from every time I—" "Garrett," she said. "Let me say it," he said. "I was wrong. Not just about the water and the mine. I was wrong about you." He paused. "I've worked this ranch 11 years. I thought I knew everything worth knowing about it. And you came here, and in a month you knew things I didn't know and did things I didn't do, and I made it harder instead of easier. That's on me." She looked at him. His face was doing the complicated thing again, but the geography of it had changed. The pride was still there, but it had moved to one side to make room for something more costly. "You dug the well," she said. "When Ethan said to you, 'Put the men on it,' and you dug it, and you didn't complain. And when Holloway came into the yard, you were already there." She paused. "That's not nothing, Garrett." He looked at the well. Still. "Accepted?" she said. "And done." He nodded once sharp the way he did everything. Then he said, "What's in Helena that Aldridge is waiting on?" She looked at him sidelong. "You'll know when we know," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair enough," he said, and walked back toward the barn. The confirmation from Helena arrived on a Thursday morning by telegraph, and Aldridge rode out to the ranch himself to deliver it, rather than sending a rider. That more than anything told Abigail what the telegram said before he opened his mouth. He came into the yard, and Ethan was there, and Garrett was there, and 3 of the hands found reasons to stop what they were doing and stand within hearing distance because a lawyer riding out in person, when he could have sent a rider, meant the news was too significant to be delayed by a middleman's misremembering. Aldridge got down from his horse and handed Ethan a folded paper. "The marker number matches," he said. "It's a General Land Office marker from the 1866 Territorial Survey. The boundary it establishes is 11 feet east of your current fence line." He looked at Ethan steadily. "And the federal records show that this survey marker was the primary reference point used to file the original homestead claim on this property in 1868, which means the federal boundary has always been 11 feet east of your fence." Garrett said under his breath something she chose not to hear. One of the hands said, "Lord Almighty," at a volume that suggested he hadn't intended to say it out loud. Ethan looked at the paper for a long moment. Then he looked at Aldridge. "What does this mean for the case?" he said. "It means Holloway's claim fails completely," Aldridge said. "Not just loses fails on the fundamental premise. He's been arguing that the boundary is west of where you put your fence. The federal documentation proves it's east. There's no version of his argument that survives this." He paused. "And I've sent a separate notice to the Federal Land Office in Helena regarding the unauthorized grazing. That's a separate matter, but one they'll want to look into." Ethan folded the paper. He turned and looked at Abigail, who was standing at the edge of the group, and something in his face was very simple and very clear. The face of a man who had fought for his land and his work and his 11 years and had come to the other side of it still standing and understood completely who had stood beside him. "Thank you," he said, not loud, not for the men, directly to her. "You're welcome," she said. It was the most straightforward exchange they'd had, and somehow it held more than any of the longer ones. The day before the court date, Holloway came again. Nobody had expected it, and that was what made it significant. A man who had been outmaneuvered at every turn coming back the day before the hearing was a man who had run out of moves and knew it, and the last move men like that made was often not a legal one. He came alone this time. No hands, no pretense of casual visiting. Ethan was in the yard when he rode in, and Abigail was at the kitchen window, the same window she'd stood at when he'd come the first time, and she watched with a stillness that cost her something. Holloway got down from his horse. He tied it himself, which he'd never done before. He looked at Ethan, and then he looked at the kitchen window. Not the quick assessing look of the first visit, but a long, deliberate one that said he knew she was there, and he wanted her to know he knew. She didn't step back. He looked at Ethan. "I want to talk," he said. "Just us." "There's nothing to talk about that isn't better said in court tomorrow," Ethan said. "I'm going to offer you something," Holloway said. "Before tomorrow. Because once we're in front of the judge, certain things become permanent." Ethan didn't move. "Say it here." Holloway glanced at the kitchen window again. His jaw moved. "Drop the unauthorized grazing claim," he said. "I'll withdraw the boundary dispute. Clean break, no record of either." The yard was very quiet. "You want me to let you walk away from what you did to my water and my cattle and my land?" Ethan said. "I want both of us to walk away with what we have," Holloway said, and his voice had something in it that she'd never heard from him before. Not quite desperation, but something in that neighborhood, something that had given up pretending it wasn't there. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "Wade," he said, and the first name was not friendly, it was deliberate. It was one man speaking to another with the formality stripped away to get at what was true. "You let a mine shaft poison my water for at least 2 years. You told me my management was killing my cattle when you knew the water was doing it. You filed a false boundary claim on land I've worked for 11 years. And you paid a preacher's wife to talk about my cook in the Tuesday market." Holloway's face changed. "That's what happened," Ethan said. "I'm not walking away from that, and I'm not walking away from what's right." He looked at him steadily. "We'll see you in court." Holloway stood there for a moment, with all of that sitting on him, and nowhere to put it. Then he untied his horse and mounted it, and rode out without another word. Ethan stood in the yard until the sound of the hooves had faded down the trail. Then he turned and looked at the kitchen window. Abigail was still there. He held her gaze across the distance, and she held his, and something passed between them that didn't need the yard crossed, or words said, an understanding settled and quiet of the kind that only came between people who had stood beside each other in hard places and not looked away. Then he turned back to the yard, and she turned back to the stove, and the ordinary life of the ranch went on around them like water, finding its level steady and unhurried, carrying everything forward.
Make a messin'.
The circuit court convened in Harlan's Creek at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning, in the largest room of the county building, which was not large enough for the number of people who came. Abigail sat beside Aldridge at the plaintiff's table. Ethan had suggested it. Aldridge had agreed immediately. She was a witness, and her testimony on the survey documents and the field notes and the marker was the clearest and most detailed account available. Garrett had come with 2 of the men, and they sat in the gallery with their hats in their hands in a row that looked, she thought, like a small and steady army. Holloway was at the other table with a lawyer from Billings who wore his suit like armor and had the kind of practiced ease in courtrooms that came from doing things in them you weren't supposed to do, and getting away with it often enough to stop worrying. The judge was a man named Harlan Foss, who had been doing this for 20 years and wore his authority the opposite way. Pruitt wore his loosely without display, the way men wore things they'd had long enough to forget they were wearing them. He looked at both tables. He looked at the gallery. He looked at the size of the crowd and said dryly, "This is a boundary dispute, not a town meeting. But since you're all here, try to stay quiet." A few people laughed. Most didn't. Holloway's lawyer opened with a confident and carefully constructed argument about the creek bend, the county survey, and the shift in natural landmarks over time. It was a good argument. She had known it would be. She listened to every word of it with her hands folded on the table and her face still. Then Aldridge presented the federal marker. He laid it on the judge's desk. The old iron stake cleaned and carefully wrapped for presentation, and he told the story of where it was found, and by whom and what it meant. And he provided the Helena telegraph confirmation, and he provided the original homestead filing documents showing that this marker was the primary reference point. Holloway's lawyer objected twice. Both times Judge Foss listened, and then overruled, and asked Aldridge to continue. Then Aldridge called Abigail to testify. She walked to the front of the room and stood and answered questions clearly and specifically, and she didn't look at Holloway or his lawyer. She looked at Judge Foss because he was the only person in the room whose opinion was going to matter in the next 20 minutes. She explained the field notes. She explained the cairn. She explained the marker. She explained what a federal survey marker was and what legal weight it carried, and why the county-level boundary claim couldn't survive it. Holloway's lawyer cross-examined her with the particular approach of a man who has run out of facts and has shifted to character, asking about her background, her previous employment, her lack of formal credentials, her relationship to the Callahan Ranch. Each question designed not to produce information, but to produce in the room a particular impression of who she was and what she might be worth believing. She answered every question the same way, directly, specifically, without emotion, and without defensiveness, because she had been answering questions like these her whole life, and she had learned that the most powerful thing she could do was simply continue to be exactly right about everything she said. When he was done, Judge Foss looked at his desk for a long moment. Then he looked up. "I've been on this bench 20 years, he said, in a voice that carried without effort. "And I have never had a boundary dispute present itself with cleaner documentation than what I'm looking at today." He looked at Holloway's table. "The federal survey marker establishes the eastern boundary of the Callahan property at a point 11 feet east of the current fence line. The federal homestead filing is the controlling document. The county survey and any argument derived from it is superseded." He picked up the marker from his desk and turned it in his hands once and set it back down. "The claim filed by Mr. Holloway is dismissed. The boundary stands. Additionally, the matter of unauthorized grazing on federal protected property is referred to the Federal Land Office for investigation." He set down his gavel. The room erupted. Not the chaos of a fight, the noise of something that had been held under pressure, releasing all at once voices and movement, and the particular sound of people who'd come to see something settled, being satisfied that it was. Abigail sat very still at the table, while the room moved around her. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the front wall, and breathed in and breathed out, and let the feeling move through her, the way she let everything move through her fully, without fighting it. Because fighting your own feelings was the fastest way to lose track of what they were telling you. Ethan was beside her. She hadn't heard him move from the gallery to the table, but he was there standing at her shoulder, and she looked up at him. His face was the open face, the one she'd seen on the slope when they found the cairn. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. Garrett appeared behind Ethan's shoulder with the expression of a man who had something to say, and was going to say it whether it came out right or not. "You know what you are," he said to her. "You're the best thing that's happened to that ranch in 11 years. She looked at him. "Including you." "Especially including me," he said without hesitation, and that cost him something, and they both knew it, and she respected him deeply for paying it. Cody was laughing somewhere behind her, the loose, relieved kind, and two of the hands were shaking hands with each other, and Judge Foss was already moving to his next matter with the efficiency of a man who had more work than the day allowed. Holloway was gone. She didn't see him leave. She didn't need to see it. Ethan put his hand on her shoulder, brief, warm, the kind of touch that said more than it was willing to say out loud. And then he turned to shake Aldridge's hand and speak to the men and do all the things that needed doing. She sat for one more moment at the table. She looked at the iron marker still sitting on the judge's desk. A man in 1866 had driven that stake into the ground and known that someday someone would need it, and he'd put it somewhere it could last. She thought about what it meant to leave something that lasted. She thought she was beginning to understand. The ride back from Harlan's Creek was nothing like the ride there. Going in, they'd been two people carrying the weight of something unresolved moving toward a fight that could go either direction. Coming back, the weight was gone, and what replaced it was something she didn't have a clean word for, lighter than relief, steadier than happiness. The particular feeling of a thing having landed where it was supposed to land after a long time in the air. Ethan rode beside her the same way he'd ridden beside her before, not ahead, not behind. But the silence between them had changed its texture. This one didn't require thought, it just was. After about 20 minutes he said, "What are you thinking about?" She considered the question honestly. "The marker," she said. "The man who put it there in 1866. He didn't know what it was going to matter for. He just did the job right." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say something like that," he said. "Said the best work you do is the work that outlasts your knowing why you did it." She looked at him. "Your father was a surveyor." "Farmer," he said. "Kansas." She turned to look at him fully. "Kansas." "Southeast corner," he said. "Why?" "I grew up in Kansas," she said. "My father farmed the same." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, more like the feeling of a room you thought you were seeing for the first time, revealing a door you hadn't noticed. "Why didn't you say that?" he said. "You didn't ask," she said. A pause. Then very quietly he laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, a real one. Not the half-laugh of a man being polite, but something that came from a genuine place, low and brief and entirely unguarded. It changed his face completely. She turned back to the trail before he could see what it did to hers. The ranch felt different when they rode in, not physically. The same buildings, the same yard, the same summer heat pressing down from the peaks. But the men who came out when they heard the horses had a different quality in how they held themselves, and Garrett, standing at the barn door with his arms crossed, uncrossed them when he saw their faces and said simply, "We won." "We won," Ethan said. Garrett nodded once, the way he did everything short and final, and then he turned to the men and said, "Somebody get a fire going. We're eating outside tonight." It was not the kind of thing Garrett said. It was so not the kind of thing Garrett said that two of the men stopped and looked at each other to confirm they'd heard it correctly. Then Cody let out a sound that was halfway between a cheer and a laugh, and the yard came to life in the easy, expansive way it came to life when something that had been wound tight was finally allowed to unwind. Abigail dismounted and handed her mare to the young hand who came for her and stood for a moment in the middle of all of it. The movement and the noise and the particular warmth of men who worked hard together, celebrating something they'd worked hard for together, and she felt it settle into her, the way the verdict had settled in the courtroom in stages, each one heavier and more real than the one before. Cody appeared at her elbow. "How'd he look?" he said. "Holloway," when the judge said it. "I didn't watch him," she said. Cody looked disappointed. "Not even a little." "Not even a little," she said. "I was watching the judge." "That's very disciplined of you," Cody said with the tone of someone who found it mildly unreasonable. "Go help with the fire," she said. He went grinning. She made a supper that was not practical. It was the kind of supper you made when you were feeding people who had earned something, not just fuel for the next day's work, but something that said the day had mattered, that the people eating it had mattered, that some days deserved more than efficiency. She cooked for 2 hours, and nobody came to rush her, and nobody asked when it would be ready. Garrett sent Cody to ask once if she needed help, and she sent him back with a task that kept him out of the kitchen, because what she was doing didn't need help. It needed space. When she brought the food out to the long table set up outside, the men were already seated. And the way they received it, not just the eating, but the receiving. The looking up, the particular quality of men who are not accustomed to being fed with intention. Recognizing that they are being fed with intention was something she would remember for a long time. Ethan was at the head of the table, and he looked at her when she set the last dish down, and whatever he saw on her face made him look down at his plate quickly, and she saw, just briefly, the back of his neck go dark. The way a man's neck went dark when something had gotten past the defenses, he didn't even know he was running. She sat. They ate. The summer evening came down soft off the peaks, and for a while nobody needed to talk about anything. Cool. It was Garrett who broke it. He was halfway through his second plate when he set his fork down and said to nobody in particular and to everybody at once, "I want to say something." The table went quiet. He didn't look comfortable. He never looked comfortable when he was about to be honest. But he pushed through the discomfort the way he pushed through everything straight at it, no flinching. 3 months ago, he said, I told a woman to go back to her kitchen when she came to look at a dead steer. He paused. I was wrong to say it. Wrong before I said it, and wrong after. But I said it, and I want it acknowledged that I said it. He picked up his fork again and looked at his plate. And I want it acknowledged that the same woman found the water and found the evidence and sat in that courtroom today and told a federal judge exactly what he needed to know to rule in our favor. He looked up and down the table. I've been on this ranch 11 years. I thought I knew what this land needed. I was wrong about that too. He picked up his cup. That's all. He drank. He went back to eating. The table was quiet for a moment. Then one of the older hands, a man named Dutch, who had said approximately 40 words in all the weeks Abigail had been on the ranch, lifted his cup and said, to Miss Carter. 12 cups went up. She looked at the table. She looked at the cups. She pressed her lips together and breathed in through her nose and said, thank you, and meant it in a way that the 2 words weren't really built to carry. Cody was watching her with that clear-eyed young face, and she looked at him, and he gave her the small nod, the same one he'd given her months ago in the kitchen when Ethan had spoken over Garrett at the supper table. And the continuity of it, the fact that she'd been here long enough for things to have continuity, landed somewhere deep. Ethan at the head of the table said nothing. He didn't lift his cup with the others. He was looking at her, and when she looked at him, his expression was the open one, the slope face, and it was so unguarded that she had to look away first. The twist came after supper, and it came from a direction nobody had been watching. Cody found her washing up at the outdoor basin after the men had dispersed to the bunkhouse, and his face had the tight quality, again the I heard something I don't want to tell you quality she'd learned to read in the first weeks. What is it? She said. Not a question. Ryder came in while we were eating, he said. From Helena, Federal Land Office. She set down the dish she was holding. For Ethan. For you, Cody said. She looked at him. Letter, he said. Addressed to Abigail Carter Callahan Ranch. It was forwarded from the county land office. Aldridge must have given them your location when he filed the documentation. He held it out. It's from the Federal Land Office in Helena. I don't know what it says. I only know it came, and Ethan has it. She dried her hands. She walked to the main house. Ethan was at the table in the main room. The same table where they'd spread the survey documents, where she'd read the telegram about the federal boundary where the shape of the case had assembled itself piece by piece. He had the letter in his hands, and he looked up when she came in, and she saw immediately that he'd read it. You read my letter, she said. It was open, he said. The seal was already broken. I think the county land office... He stopped. No, I read it. I shouldn't have. She held out her hand. He gave it to her. She read it standing at the table. It was 2 pages written in the formal language of federal offices, which she'd learned to translate the same way she'd learned to translate survey notation, by understanding that every carefully chosen word was pointing at something specific. The Federal Land Office in Helena had been tracking a series of boundary fraud cases across 3 counties in Montana Territory. The same pattern contaminated water sources, manipulated county surveys. False boundary claims filed against struggling ranchers had appeared in 6 separate cases over the previous 4 years. 2 of those ranchers had sold their land at loss prices rather than fight. 2 had lost their water access entirely. The remaining 2 had contested and lost at the county level. Callahan Ranch was the first case in which the federal documentation had been located and presented successfully. The Federal Land Office wanted to know how she had known to look for it. They wanted her account in writing of her methodology in reading the survey field notes and identifying the cairn and the iron marker. They were building a case against the party responsible for the pattern. Wade Holloway's name was not in the letter, but it didn't need to be. She set the letter on the table. Ethan was watching her. 6 ranches, she said. Yes, he said. He's been doing this for 4 years. At least, Ethan said. And he's been getting away with it because nobody had the documents. He paused. Until you found them. She was very still. The full shape of what she'd walked into, not just a dispute over Callahan's east pasture, but the tail end of something systematic and deliberate and long-running, was arriving in stages, and each stage was larger than the one before. They want my account, she said. Yes, Ethan said. He held her gaze. Abigail. What Holloway was doing, what he did to those other ranchers, if your account helps the federal office build the case? I'll write it, she said. It'll put your name in federal documents, he said. People will know who you are, what you know, what you did. People already know, she said. Mrs. Alderton saw to that. Something moved in his eyes, not quite amusement, not quite pain, the space between them. This is different, he said. This is federal. This is Monk permanent, she said. Yes, she looked at him. You said that word before, in the yard when Holloway offered to make it go away. You said once we're in front of the judge, certain things become permanent. I remember, he said. I want this to be permanent, she said. What he did to those ranchers. I want there to be a permanent record of it. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on the table threw light across his face, and she could see the exact moment he stopped trying to protect her from her own decision and accepted that she didn't need protecting. Then I'll get you paper, he said. He got her paper. She sat at the table and began to write, and he sat across from her with coffee and said nothing, and that was the most companionable 2 hours she had spent in a very long time. She wrote for 3 days. Not continuously. The ranch still needed feeding. The well still needed monitoring. The ordinary life of the place moved around her the way it always had. But every evening after supper and some mornings before the men were up, she sat at the table in the main room and wrote her account. She wrote about the horses and the trough. She wrote about the sulfur and the mine shaft. She wrote about the field notes and the cairn and the marker. She wrote about the methodology her father had taught her, how to read what the land was saying, how to understand what the documents were actually recording versus what they appeared to record. She wrote it in plain language, the way a woman wrote who had learned to make herself understood to people who were not sure they wanted to understand her. On the second evening, Ethan came in while she was writing and looked over her shoulder at the page and said, "You write the way you talk." "Is that good or bad?" she said. "Good," he said. "It's very good." He straightened. "Most people write to sound like they know things. You write to say what you know. It's different." She looked up at him. "My father said never use a formal word when a plain one will do." "Smart man," Ethan said. "He was," she said. Past tense. He heard it. "When did you lose him?" he said, and the question was quiet and careful, the way Ethan asked things when he was asking something that mattered to him. 8 years ago, she said. That's when I started working ranches. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't say "I'm sorry" the way people said it when they'd run out of other things to say. He just sat, and she understood that was its own kind of response. "What was he like?" Ethan said. She set down her pen. She thought about her father, not the grief of him, which she'd carried for 8 years, and knew the weight of, but the actual man. The way he'd walked a field. The way he'd crouched and pressed his hand to the soil and told her what it was saying. The way he'd treated her knowledge as worth having from the time she was old enough to follow him. "He treated me like I was worth listening to," she said. "From the time I was very young, He didn't have sons. He had me, and he taught me everything he knew, and he never once suggested that what he was teaching me was wasted on a girl." She paused. "I spent 8 years after he died looking for that." The table was very quiet. Ethan said, "Did you find it?" She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them. The open pages of her account. The letter from Helena folded at the edge of the table. "I think I might be finding it," she said. He held her gaze. He held it longer than looking required. "Abigail," he said. Her name in his voice the way it had been on the slope on the open face without defense or calculation. "Not yet," she said softly. "Let me finish writing first." He looked at her. Then he nodded, slow and certain the way he made decisions that he'd fully thought through and wasn't going to take back. "I'll wait," he said. The federal office response came 2 weeks later. It came by rider directly from Helena, this time, not forwarded through the county office, which told her that Pruitt's involvement in the chain of information was being carefully removed. The rider handed the letter to Abigail directly in the yard in front of 3 of the hands, and didn't ask for Ethan first. That was the first thing that mattered. The letter was from the Regional Federal Land Commissioner. He had reviewed her account. He had shared it with the federal attorney's office. Based on her documentation and testimony, combined with the physical evidence of the survey marker and the field notes, the federal office was opening a formal investigation into a pattern of land fraud affecting no fewer than 7 properties in 3 counties. Wade Holloway was named in the letter. She read it in the yard, and then she walked to the barn because Ethan was with one of the horses, a routine she'd learned months ago. Tuesdays, he worked the young stock. She found him with the same long rope and the same slow circles, and she stood at the fence, the way she'd stood at the fence the first time, except everything was different now. He looked up. She held up the letter. He dropped the rope and came to the fence. He read it standing beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the afternoon heat. He read it once and then again, and then he folded it very carefully along its creases and held it in both hands. "It's over," he said. "For him mostly," she said. "For the others, the ones who sold or lost their water, it's still complicated. But the fraud is on record," he said. "On permanent record," she said. He looked at her. The fold of paper in his hands. The long rope trailing in the dirt where he'd dropped it. The young horse standing patiently at the end of it waiting. "I want to show you something," he said. "It's shown." He took her to the east pasture, not the slope, not the mine shaft, not the cairn. The other end of the pasture, the far corner where the fence line turned north, and the land opened up into a wide level stretch that caught the afternoon light in a particular way. She'd noticed the stretch before. She'd noticed everything about this land before it was simply the way she was built. But she hadn't understood what she was looking at until he stopped and turned and said, "I've been thinking about expanding the herd. Real expansion, not just recovering from the drought. Building something bigger." He paused. "I've been thinking about it for 3 years and not doing it because I've been doing everything alone, and alone has its limits." She looked at the land. She looked at him. "I've been thinking," he said, and his voice had gone to the quiet place again, the place it went when he was putting down something he'd been carrying a long time, "that I'd like a partner, for the ranch." He paused. "For everything." The afternoon was very still. "Ethan," she said. "I know it's fast," he said immediately. "I know you've been here 4 months, and I know what that looks like, and I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not saying I know everything there is to know about you. I know I don't. I know there's 8 years of ranches I don't know about, and a Kansas farm I don't know about, and a father I'd have liked to meet." He looked at her directly. "But I know what you did here. I know what you saw that I didn't see, and what you did about it, and how you did it. And I know that the ranch is different than it was 4 months ago, and I'm different than I was 4 months ago." He stopped again. "And I know I don't want you to leave. I know that more clearly than I've known most things." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a horse at a trough that wouldn't drink. She thought about walking east in the dark with a lamp turned low, following what she could read in the ground. She thought about 11 years of building something alone, and one morning when a woman rode in on a bay mare, and he'd looked at her the way he'd looked at a fence post, looking for the problem, and she'd looked at his water trough instead, and known already that something was wrong. She thought about her father saying, "Never use a formal word when a plain one will do." "I'm not leaving," she said. It was what she'd told him 4 months ago in the kitchen, and it meant more now, and they both understood exactly how much more. He held her gaze. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," she said. He took one step toward her, and she held her ground, and he stopped just close enough that the distance between them was a decision rather than a gap. And he said, "Can I?" And she said yes, before he'd finished asking, because some answers didn't need the question to finish to be ready. He put his hand along her jaw, and she let him, and the afternoon held them there for a moment, in the particular stillness of something that had been moving toward itself for a long time and had finally arrived. Shelter. The hard thing came last. She should have known it would. In her experience, the hardest thing always came after you thought the hard things were done. It came in the form of a woman named Margaret Hale, who rode out from Harlan's Creek on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the court ruling and asked for Abigail specifically. Not Ethan. Abigail. Margaret Hale was 60 years old and had the kind of face that life had written on, honestly not prettily, but with clarity. She was the widow of a rancher named Simon Hale, and she had sold her ranch 2 years ago to a buyer she now understood with the help of Aldridge's investigation to have been acting on behalf of Wade Holloway. She had sold it for half what it was worth because she'd been told the boundary dispute made it unsaleable at full price. She sat at the kitchen table across from Abigail with her hands folded on the surface and said, "I want to know if there's any way to get it back." Abigail looked at her. She looked at the hands calloused, steady, the hands of a woman who had worked land and understood it, and had it taken from her by a lie that had been made to look like legal process. She felt something that started in her chest and moved outward. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning," Margaret told her. It took an hour. Abigail listened the way she'd learned to listen, not for what was being said, but for what the facts were underneath what was being said, the way you listen to the ground for what was underneath the surface. When Margaret finished, Abigail said, "The sale contract, do you still have it?" "Every page," Margaret said. "And the original survey documents for your property?" "My husband filed them in a box," Margaret said. "I have the box." "Bring the box to Aldridge," Abigail said. "This week. Tell him Abigail Carter sent you." Margaret looked at her. Her eyes were dry. This was not a woman who came looking for sympathy, but something in them shifted. "Do you think there's a real chance?" she said. Abigail looked at her steadily. "The same fraud that was used against this ranch was used against yours," she said. "The federal investigation is open. The pattern is documented. If your survey documents show what I think they'll show," she paused. "Yes, I think there's a real chance." Margaret stood. She picked up her hat. She paused at the kitchen door and looked back. "They said you were just the cook," she said. Abigail met her eyes. "I know what they said," she said. Margaret Hale nodded once, slow and certain. Then she left. Ethan had been at the barn door. He'd seen Margaret ride in, and he'd given them the kitchen without being asked, because he understood by now the kind of conversation that needed space. When Margaret rode out, he came in and looked at Abigail's face and said, "Who was that?" She told him. He listened the same way she'd listened all the way through without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You sent her to Aldridge?" "Yes." "How many others do you think there are?" She looked at him. "The federal letter said 7 properties," she said. "Margaret makes 8. There may be more who don't know yet what happened to them." She paused. "Holloway's been doing this for 4 years. He's had time to be thorough." Ethan sat down at the table that had become the center of everything that mattered on this ranch. He pressed both hands flat on the surface. "We should tell Aldridge to reach out," he said, "proactively, to other ranchers in the 3 counties. Let them know the investigation is open and what to bring in." "Yes," she said. "Will you?" he started. Yes, she said, before he could finish. He looked at her. You don't know what I was going to ask. You were going to ask if I'd help coordinate it, she said. Draft the outreach letters, work with Aldridge on what documentation people should bring in, help them understand what they're looking at. A pause. Yes, he said. That's what I was going to ask. Then yes, she said. He looked at her across the table with the open face, the unguarded one, and said, You know what you are. The cook, she said. No, he said. Not for a long time. She held his gaze. What then? He looked at her for a long moment. The storm-gray eyes settled and clear. The 11 years of alone written on him, and something new written over it. Something that had been written 4 months at a time in water and ground and courtrooms and kitchen tables, and one long rope dropped in the dirt when he came to a fence to read a letter. The person who understands this land better than anyone, he said. And the person I want beside me while I keep learning it. She put her hand on the table between them. Just set it there, palm down steady. He put his over it. Outside, the summer afternoon was full on the peaks, and the new well was holding steady, and 12 men were doing the work of a ranch that was not going under, that was not losing its water, or its boundary, or its future. Somewhere in Harlan's Creek, a federal investigation was building a case from documents that a woman in 1866 and a woman 4 months ago had each done their jobs well enough to make possible. And inside, at a kitchen table, that had held every hard conversation and every real decision of the last 4 months. 2 people who had started out as employer and cook and become something that didn't have a simple name, yet held on to each other's hands and understood, without needing to say it, that some things you built alone for a long time before you understood that building them together was what they'd always been meant for. The quiet women, the ones who watched and understood and knew exactly what needed to be done, were not overlooked forever. Sometimes they just had to find the right piece of ground, and then they stayed.